start us off, please, with your
Sure.
7, 8, don't need 8
Okay.
position.
So I guess I'd like to just start by saying that I've always been, excuse me, hang on, I'm just gonna clear my throat there. I didn't want to do that in everybody's ear. So I've always been really proud to say that I'm a Unitarian and that we have 7 principles to live up to, which are all positive. And so what I'd like us to do is to take the time to listen carefully to all our members so that we can select the very best words that we will use to eventually describe our actions. At the moment, we have it backwards. We seem to be rushing and we're taking no substantive actions to solve important problems. And so sadly, in that rush to make the words official, we're also tearing our fragile Unitarian alliance apart, creating more problems and only making it more difficult to take action in the future as a united group. And so ultimately, I have 2 concerns about the proposed 8th principle that make it difficult for me to support. 1, it isn't a principle. It's a covenant to action, a commitment to serious anti-racism work. And so it would thus rest awkwardly within the existing set of principles that are timeless guides to right living. And the second one is that it focuses on what we don't want, racism, rather than on what we do want, and a covenant to live and create the focus of the existing principles. And so in my experience, it's generally more empowering to be for something rather than against it. So my question to you is, so what's the rush? I don't see why we can't map out a process like the UUA has over 1 to 2 years for a full discussion of the matter. A year or 2 in the tiny history of our faith tradition, it would seem like pushing this through in a few months under the current circumstances in the manner we are is unnecessary and unlikely to result in anything approaching consensus. In fact, I suspect that if it is forced, we'll have angry members and people leaving, repeating many of the mistakes that are happening south of the border. And I would really like to avoid this.
Thank you, Kelly. Bill?
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you everyone for attending. I will leave some of the questions that Kelly raised to the questions that will be raised from the floor, but I want to start by talking about why I think this is a powerful principle and should be adopted. So my party is committed to embedding the 8th principle, call for action to dismantle racism and other oppressions, right in the principles that are our shorthand way of defining who we are as Unitarian Universalists. As an older, white, straight, cis male, I recognize that I've been swimming in an ocean of white supremacy my whole life, generally without much or any awareness of all the ways that I've benefited from a worldview, from structures, and from systems that oppress Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized people. That lack of awareness limits my capacity for growth and wholeness. And in committing to the 8th principle, my party and I are committing to see what we've allowed to remain hidden, broadening our grasp of what's true and what's real, and then seeing more, we commit to work for change. The 8th principle is, I think, first a commitment to doing the right thing. And I actually don't think there's much quarrel among Unitarians on that point. Second, I think the 8th principle is about our future. Canada is changing and becoming more diverse. 22% of Canadian population identified as people of color in 2016. That'll be about 1/3 by 2036, which is just 15 years from now. We need to prepare as a congregation, as individuals, as a denomination to be welcoming and to be effective and to be actively participating in that future just for our survival and for our relevance. Third, the attitudes that sustain racism in Canada run very deep, and changing them involves challenging all concepts and attitudes that divide us into us and them, into we and not we. Reverend Victoria has described this as spiritual work because spirituality is about our sense of connection, our sense of oneness with all people and all of creation. So the explicit task referred to in the 8th principle is anti-racism, but it cuts much deeper and broader than that. As I said, I think most of us agree with the goal of dismantling racism. Any differences of opinion, I think, are focused on 3 Ps: the proposed means, that is the principle, the process, and the priority. Let me focus here on 2 questions. Is the 8th principle even a principle? And do we need to add a principle to do this work? Our 7 principles are statements of the values that unite us as Unitarian Universalists. They're a mix of statements of belief and statements about who we are, about identity. And implicitly, they are all calls for action, since they all begin with the idea that we affirm and promote each principle. The 8th principle is a more explicit call to action, but I think it's also a statement of belief and identity. It says we identify as people who don't just affirm the inherent worth and dignity of everyone, for instance, but we go further and are explicitly anti-racist in attitude and action in all we do. I think that's positive, not negative. I think that's a principle, and I think it's a powerful principle. We don't need to add a principle to do anti-racism work. To varying degrees, we have been and are doing anti-racism work. I think making it a principle grows out of 2 things. One is a sense of frustration at our lack of progress. After decades of work on this, we're still a predominantly, in most cases, a very predominantly white denomination and a congregation. And it grows out of a sense of urgency that recognizes that persisting racism and oppression blight the lives of marginalized people, but I think compromise the integrity of the lives of the rest of us as well. So the principle says we are prepared to be identified with this commitment, to be accountable to this commitment. And it says, by being at the level of our defining document, that this matters and this is who we are. That's challenging. Taking this step may stir up some fear or defensiveness in many of us. I get that. I don't want anybody calling me racist, even implicitly. But I think we need to distinguish where our concerns about process and priority are real concerns about process and priority, and where they might perhaps betray some fear. And I don't think we should let fear stand in our way of seizing a historic opportunity for change, for justice making, and for spiritual growth. Thank you.